Okay, so let's go through this, right, and then we can work through some practice of the FRQs. So I want to first do kind of the Constitution review, right, and you can kind of more or less turn this into like a cheat sheet, right, of like here are the clauses that I think are important for you to know. Then we're going to go through the policy-making process, and then we're going to talk about the FRQs. So we're going to start with the Constitution. So, yeah, so for the Constitution, you do not need to know like every single enumerated power, right? Or every single like line of the Constitution, but you should know the basics of like what is in the basic structure, like what each article talks about, and then the certain clauses or sections that I'm going to talk about now. Oh, is it not doing my fun little Zoom? No. Oh, it's because I'm recording. It doesn't do all the fun animations.
That was a lot of recording.
What? No more recording. Okay, whatever. All right, so Article 1, right? Article 1, it deals with the legislature, right? The first clause that is important is the what's called the vesting clause. There's a vesting clause in Article 2 as well. But this is the idea that like Congress has the sole authority to make laws, right? Congress has the authority to make laws. All that legislative power is vested in the Congress, right? And then the Congress will consist of two houses, right? The House and the Senate, right? You should know that Article 1 is also where you get the language about the census, that like every 10 years we have to count people in order to apportion representatives to the House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives is apportioned based on population, where the Senate is based on 2 senators for each state, right? The 3/5 clause is also in this article. As a quick reminder, right, senators serve for 6-year terms. House of Representatives serve for 2-year terms. Originally, senators were not elected by the people. They were chosen by state legislatures. It wasn't until, when was it? It was 1913 with the 17th Amendment that you get direct election of senators. Prior to that, the state governments would just choose their senators, right? The 17th in 1913.
Wait, what was the second thing you said?
Senate is 6 years, and originally they were selected by state legislatures.
Wait, how are they selected now?
And then how long is the other one?
2 years is the House. Now you vote for your senator, right? So like when you vote in November, not in California, but you won't like it's not. There's not always a senator up for election, or do we have someone up for election? And is there a Senate seat in California up? I don't pay attention to it because it's not a swing state. So for the House, every member of the House of Representatives is up every election. Right, but for the Senate, you're only up every 6 years. So, like, at 1 out of 3 electoral cycles, you will not vote for a senator, right?
Yeah, we have.
Is it whose seat is it?
Are you also going to go over each one of these?
That's what. Yeah, that's what I'm. Yeah, I'm still here. I'm still at the like apportionment.
Okay.
So is it her seat? Oh yeah, I guess there is. Okay. Oh, you're right. There is a Senate seat. Right. It's the shift guardian. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, that was me being dumb. Sorry. Because there was a primary in the spring. I just completely forgot about it. Okay. The Article 1 also details the legislative process. Right. The legislative process says that an identical bill has to pass both houses by a majority vote. Then it goes to the president's desk, where the president can either sign it or veto it. Right. If the president vetoes it, the House and the Senate can override the veto with a 2/3 vote of both houses. So that's like getting towards the checks and balances idea. But the veto provision, notably, is in Article 1, not in Article 2. Article 1 also lists a series of what are known as enumerated powers or expressed powers. These are the powers that are explicitly given to Congress. These are the things that Congress is legally required to do. These include things like coin money, raise an army and navy, regulate interstate and foreign trade, declare war. All these things are like things that are exclusively given to Congress. The Article 1 also says that there are certain things that Congress can't do. These are the denied powers. I'll get to the interstate commerce and necessary and proper clause in a second. These denied, like Congress cannot declare a title of nobility, right? They cannot make Gavin a duke, right? Congress cannot deny the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is the idea that if, like, I arrest Shayna, I have to bring her before a judge within a certain amount of time to be charged with a crime.
They can't just charge her like she gets a trial, basically.
It's not so much about charging. It's more about, like, I can't just lock Shayna up in prison without charging her, right? I can't just, like, arrest her and then, like, indefinitely hold her because, like, I don't like her, right? I have to actually. Habeas corpus in Latin means behold the body. So it's like, or bring forth the body, sorry. So the idea is, like, you have to literally bring the person that you're holding in front of a judge to charge them with a crime and give them a chance to defend themselves, right? You also can't pass bills of attainder, whereas like Congress passes a law that says Xavier is guilty of a crime and has to go to jail, right? So it's basically like those are all powers that like feudal kings and queens would wield, and it's basically saying like feudalism doesn't exist in the United States. The two important clauses that you really need to, or I guess the three that are used by Congress to expand the power of Congress are these ones, but it's really the interstate commerce and the necessary and proper clauses. The general welfare clause is in the enumerated power section, Article 1, Section 8. It says like Congress shall pass laws that promote the general welfare, basically saying like Congress can do things to make the country better. But the interstate commerce clause says that Congress has the authority to regulate trade between the states. That means that, like, if you are a business that does business across state lines, right? If you build a car in Detroit, Michigan, and you sell it in California, right? That car is, and your business is subject to congressional legislation, right? This is one of the clauses that greatly expands federal power, especially in the 20th and 21st century, when pretty much like all business crosses state lines, right? Like there's very few businesses that every single part of the production process and distribution and consumption occurs within like that state, right? The other is the necessary and proper clause. This is at the end of Article 1, Section 8, and it says that Congress shall have the authority to pass any laws that are necessary and proper to carrying out these enumerated powers, right? So, for example, the draft is not listed explicitly in Article 1, Section 8, but it does say that they shall raise and maintain an army and navy. So the draft would be something that is necessary and proper to maintaining an army and navy, right? Requiring all men at the age of 18 to register with selective service, right? The necessary and proper clause was also used to justify the Bank of the United States in McCulloch versus Maryland, right? Okay. Article 2 is the executive branch, right? And so again, we have a vesting clause that vests all executive power in the president and the vice president of the United States, right? Basically saying like, we are going to have a chief executive, they are going to be the president and the vice president. The electoral college is how we choose the president and the vice president, right? So according to the Constitution, each state gets the number of electoral votes that is equivalent to their total representation in Congress. So you get an electoral vote for each member of the House of Representatives and an electoral vote for each senator. So Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota each get 3 electoral votes, right? California, I believe, has 51 electoral votes. Or 54 electoral votes? Okay.
For how many senator in the House of Representatives?
Exactly, your total representation in Congress, right? So the minimum number of electoral votes that you can have is 3. Thank you. And then there are also electoral votes. Washington, D.C. gets an electoral vote. I think the Virgin Islands get an electoral vote. And there's a few like haphazard ones. There's 3 haphazard. I think Puerto Rico gets 1 electoral vote. So you get 538. There are 538 electoral votes, and it's the first to 270, right, wins the electoral college. In every state except for Nebraska and Maine, the electoral college votes are decided based on who wins the statewide popular vote, right? So you can win California by a single vote, and you get all 54 electoral college votes, right? In Nebraska and Maine, the electoral votes that are like linked to the senators are determined by the statewide vote. But then each congressional district has its own electoral vote, right? So that's why in Nebraska, the congressional district around Omaha often goes blue, and there's an congressional district in Maine that often goes red, even though the statewide votes are flipped, right? So there are like some exceptions there. The president has the the take care clause is the clause that says that the president shall take care that the laws passed by Congress are faithfully executed into law. This is the authority this is the clause that gives the president the authority to like engage in unilateral actions, to pass executive orders, to direct agencies to enforce laws and implement laws in a particular way. This is basically the clause that authorizes the president to do whatever the president needs to do in order to actually like implement the laws passed by Congress, right? Now, the president isn't doing all of these things themselves, right? The president is relying on the federal bureaucracy, and they are delegating that authority, but ultimately the buck stops with the president, right? The president is ultimately responsible for implementing the acts of Congress. The president is constitutionally required to give a State of the Union. It doesn't actually have to be a State of the Union, like a televised address like it is now. And like originally it was like a letter that the president would write to Congress. But they have to kind of like advise Congress on the State of the Union and make recommendations. And the president has the power to appoint officers of the United States, ambassadors, and judges to the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court. But they have to do so with the advice and consent of the Senate, right? So when if I was the president and I wanted to nominate Charles to be a justice of the Supreme Court, I would have to get approval of the Senate to do so, right? If I'm nominating Gavin to be my ambassador to Italy, right, I would need the approval of the Senate approval to do that.
So he can nominate who?
Ambassadors, government, like high-ranking government officials, so like cabinet level officials, agency heads, things like that, and judges in the federal judiciary.
But he needs Congress's approval.
Just the Senate's approval. So.
So if it's a Republican versus like a Democratic Senate, would it like no cabinet member?
Yeah, if the election were held today and the polls were 100% accurate, it would be highly likely that you would get Harris winning the presidency, Republicans picking up 2 seats in the Senate and having a 51-49 majority in the Senate, and it would be very difficult for the Harris administration to like get any like their preferred picks, right? What they would end up probably doing is picking maybe not they would like throw a bone. They might pick like a Republican or a moderate like Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State or something like that to like as like kind of like a horse trade with Republicans to get their other.
Yeah, so like they've talked to the Senate, like, well, if we pick like this Republican senator or state, like we can get this done.
Yeah, exactly. Like generally, it used to be that like the advise and consent was pretty much like unless you pick like a nut job, we're going to sign off on it, right? But since started a little bit under the Obama administration, but absolutely 100% in the Trump administration, both parties have started playing more constitutional hardball, being like, actually, we're if we don't if we disagree with them ideologically, we are threatened to vote against them, right? So it used to be just like assumed that like, hey, you won the election, you get to choose your cabinet, right?
Yeah.
And then it became much more like contested terrain as like the country became more polarized and people started playing constitutional hardball with that. So like we'll have to see what would happen. Like in either case, in January, we're going to start seeing these Senate hearings for that. Because like if Trump wins, right, he's going to have his own cabinet. If Harris wins, she's going to have her own cabinet. There is some legal provision that would allow certain agency heads and to not automatically resign. They don't have to automatically resign. It's like a custom that they resign at the end of an administration. So one thing Harris could do is if Harris wins, would like keep the Biden cabinet more or less, assuming that they didn't want to like leave. If the Republicans threaten to like not approve any of their nominees, right? It's not a good look though to like say like we don't like you even though you won the presidential election. Therefore, we're going to like prevent the government from functioning by not approving your nominees to run these executive agencies. And it doesn't actually stop the government from functioning because you can appoint an acting head of these agencies because like the government still has to work, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so in theory you could very much see like, and we'll see this even if Trump wins, right? Even like if Trump wins and there's a Trump Senate, because there would only be like 1 or 2 votes, right? Like there could be a situation where like he picks someone super controversial for like if he actually picked like RFK to run the National Institute of Health, right? Right. If he actually like he said he would do, right? Like I could see some moderate Republicans in the Senate, right, saying like, I don't think you should pick this person to be the NIH. I'm actually going to vote with the Democrats against that, right? Because the balance is so tight. Okay. So that's the executive branch. The president also, right, as you remember, is the commander in chief of the armed forces. They are the head of this. They are the chief diplomat. They are the head of the United State. They are this head of state. Like they negotiate treaties, but treaties also have to get approved by the Senate, right? Any questions about the president? Okay. Article 3 is the judicial branch. It's actually like really short in the Constitution. It basically just says that there will be a Supreme Court and any other courts that Congress will establish, right? The Congress, through authorizing legislation, not the Constitution, actually sets up how like the federal judiciary is structured. So remember how we talked about like there's 13, there are the different districts, right? And then there's the appellate circuit, right? Like all of those district courts and appellate courts are created by Congress, not the Constitution. So the number of appellate circuits is a function of congressional legislation, not the Constitution. The important clause here is the good behavior clause, right? This is the idea that members of the federal judiciary, they serve for life, or at least they serve until they are impeached, they retire, or they die. There's some constitutional debate over, because Biden has recently proposed like something like a term limit, saying that like everyone would get like 18-year terms, right? And there's some arguments that like that would need a constitutional amendment, because but there's some arguments that I've read where the good behavior, it's a good behavior for your term, not a it's good behavior, not lifetime. So it could be like as long as it's evenly applied to all justices, right? And they are not being like removed prior to that fixed term, that it wouldn't necessarily run afoul of the Constitution. However, this is the caveat, right? If Congress were to pass legislation, they're not going to, because there's a Republican House, right? Pass legislation instituting like a 20-year term limit for justices of the Supreme Court, Texas is going to sue. It's going to go up to the Supreme Court. It's going to get appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is ultimately going to decide on what the meaning of the good behavior clause. And am I going to decide and impose a term limit on myself? Probably not, right? So like it's like I can't see the judicial reform going anywhere outside of a constitutional amendment, and it's unlikely to get a constitutional amendment passed as long as Republicans control at least one of the houses, because remember, constitutional amendments, as we'll get to in Article 5, need 2/3 vote in both houses, right?
What about packing?
Packing would still probably require congressional action to change the size of the Supreme Court, right? Because like there's nothing in the Constitution that says it's 9 justices. It was the number 9 came from a Congressional Judiciary Act that fixed the number, that said that there would be 9 Supreme Court justices because there were 9 appellate circuits. Now we have 13 appellate circuits, but the law hasn't changed to like say that we would have 13 appellate. Like you could make an argument that we should have like 1 Supreme Court justice for each appellate circuit, right? And you would have 13. A lot of other constitutional courts, as you'll learn about next semester, have larger constitutional courts. They also separate constitutional courts from their Supreme Court. So they have like one court that's just involved in like resolving constitutional disputes, and another Supreme Court that deals with like statutory, like the other kind of things that the Supreme Court does. So like you could change the structure of the Supreme Court, but that would also require Congress to pass legislation, which is highly unlikely unless like the Democrats sweep the election, which is unlikely based on the current poll.
So for the test, you have to remember like the specifics of each article.
You should know like 1 is Congress, 2 is the executive, 3 is the courts, 4 is the states, 5 is the amendment process, 6 is the supremacy, 7 is the ratification process.
Wait, what's the treason clause?
The treason clause. Oh, sorry. The treason clause basically says that like treason is bad and you can be executed for it. Article 3 also deals with like certain questions of like where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. I've never seen an AP question about like that question of jurisdiction, but like it's like a more complicated legal argument. So Article 4 deals with how the relations among the states, right? The really important ones are the full faith and credit and privileges and immunities, right? Full faith and credit is the like driver's license and marriage certificate one, right? Like if you have like the states basically recognize laws and official documents of other states, right? So if you were legally married in California and you moved to Washington, you're married. You don't have to apply for a new marriage
Basically,
license.
have to respect the laws for other states.
Yes.
Wait,
Now,
doesn't it stop at gun laws though?
right. So like you could, because that's like you can. It's mostly for like official documents, right? If like purchasing a gun is legal in one state and it's not, I mean, the Second Amendment's incorporated at this. to this level of the states, right? But like states can still have different laws about what is legal to do, right? But it's like if you did a thing that was legal in one state, right? Like got a driver's license, got married, bought a car, right? And then you move to another state, right? That car is still your property. Now, if the law is it's legal to possess an unmarked handgun in Texas, and then you move to California and there are different gun laws, you still have to comply with those gun laws because you're now a resident in that state, right?
Yeah, but like if you, I just don't understand if you have like those like open carry permits in your vehicle.
Right. If you have an open, because the open carry permit isn't like is not the same as like it is not the same. Because it's not so much the document there, it's like the specific like action, right? Now, if you move from California to Washington, and you declare like your residency is in Washington and you register to vote there, Washington will require you to get a new driver's license that is from Washington, right? So like there's gradations there. The Privileges and Immunities Clause basically says that like the states can't prohibit you from like freely traveling amongst the states, or like they can't, or like if you go on vacation, if you live in California, you go on vacation in Florida, you're like allowed, you don't need to get like a visa to enter Florida. You are allowed to like buy things in Florida, right? You can like right, like the state can't just say like actually no, only residents of Florida can get a hotel in Florida, right? Like that's illegal. Then there's the guarantee clause. This is the clause that like only me and a few other people care about, which is the federal government has an obligation to guarantee that each state has a Republican government. Article 5 concerns amendments. Yeah, the guarantee clause says that the federal government has to guarantee that each state has a Republican government. That means that they have to guarantee that like the states like maintain like democracy and voting rights and things like that.
Wait, so why are you the only one that cares?
There's no case law on it, right? Like the Supreme Court has never really turned to the guarantee clause on questions of like voting rights or the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. They've only turned to the 14th and 15th Amendments. Charles Sumner, the radical Republican senator from the Reconstruction era, he argued that like Reconstruction was authorized because of the guarantee clause, right? That what they were doing, radical Reconstruction in the South was authorized because of the powers given to Congress by the guarantee clause, but like there's no like case law on the guarantee clause. The reason why I went quickly over that is because it's a thing I care about, but no one else cares about. Okay, Article 5 says, hey, if you don't like the amendment, you can change, or don't like the Constitution, you can amend it and change it. So you can do the congressional route, which is you propose a constitutional amendment in Congress, and it passes both houses by a 2/3 majority, and then it goes to the states where 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. There was actually recently, I saw, a constitutional amendment proposed in Congress to that would require each member of Congress to submit 5 names of potential replacements to their state governor if in case there was like an act of terrorism or political violence that like killed a member of Congress or like blew up the Capitol building, so that like there would be a way to like quickly reconvene a functioning government. I don't think it's going anywhere, but it was like it was like a group of 2 Republicans and 1 Republican senator, 1 Republican House member, and 1 Democratic House member and Democratic senator got together and was like, hey, like we should have a continuity plan. Like we have it for the president, right? We have the 25th Amendment, but we should have something like, let's say a bomb goes off at the State of the Union and all of Congress is killed. Like we need to recreate the legislative branch quickly. But I would still have to get passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and go to the states where it would be ratified by 3/4 of the states.
I thought you only need 2/3 in the House and then Senate is majority, or majority in that House and then 2/3.
For the constitutional amendment process, it's 2/3 of both houses.
Oh.
You're thinking of impeachment,
Oh.
where it's a majority in the House and then a 2/3 in the Senate. You can also go the constitutional convention route, where 2/3 of these states request to a constitutional convention, where the constitutional convention recommends changes to the Constitution, and then those changes then go to the states to be ratified. Every amendment that we have to the Constitution has been proposed and ratified through the first route, through this congressional route. Article 6 says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The most important clause in this is the supremacy clause, right? Article 6 says that, like, basically if there's a conflict between state law and federal law, that federal law trumps, right? It also has a clause that says that you have to, if you're going to be an elected official or an officer of the United States, that you take an oath of office to preserve and defend the Constitution, and that you cannot be required to take any religious test, right? So there cannot be like you cannot be required to like be any religion or be Christian or be, right? There's anyone from any religion can serve in the government. The only thing you have to swear is an oath to support and defend the Constitution. The important part is really the supremacy clause, right? The supremacy clause is part of what ruled in McCulloch versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court ruled that they ruled on the necessary and proper clause to say that the Bank of the United States is constitutional, and they ruled on the supremacy clause that Maryland cannot tax the bank because that would make state power more powerful than the federal government, right? Any questions on Article 6?
Sorry, what's the last one?
That you cannot be required to like swear that you are a person of faith or a person of a particular faith. Article 7, last one, says the Constitution goes into effect when 9 states ratify it. This is more of like a historical. I can't imagine any questions about Article 7 being asked, right? Because it literally just says this Constitution goes into effect after 9 states have ratified it. For the states that have ratified it. So, like, if New York hadn't ratified the Constitution, they would have been their own sovereign state.
So 9 states need to ratify it before it
in like 1788, yeah, right? Like, this is a historical question. Like, this is like, when does this Constitution go into effect? When 9 states ratify it, for those 9 states, they are now bound by the Constitution, right? Does that make sense? So, like, if you didn't ratify the Constitution, you wouldn't be part of the United States. You'd be your own thing, right? There is no constitutional provision for leaving the United States, which was part of like Lincoln's argument that like the South cannot legally secede, right, in the Civil War, is that there's no constitutional provision for leaving the United States. So like in his view, the Confederate States of America never existed, right? The South was never, they were in an act of rebellion. They were just violating federal law because there's nothing in federal law that allows you to leave the United States. Any questions about the Constitution? Okay. Let's talk about policy making. So, we're going to walk through an imaginary bill from start to finish. So, a bill starts with an idea, in which a member of Congress has an idea for a law. They say we should do something.
This is the pace that I like.
What might be an idea that you have for a law? But yeah, like
every new person that comes to our country must be taxed.
Must be taxed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Take all funds for public education and health and put it into the
Yeah, right. Like, so they could be an appropriations bill. They could change like the conditions of immigration and naturalization. They could create a new branch of the military. They could do lots of things, right? But it starts with an idea. Then the bill goes to the Speaker of the House, if it starts in the House, right? And I refer this bill to the House Natural Resource Committee, or whatever the relevant committee is. In the Senate, technically the presiding officer of the Senate, so it's technically it's either the Vice President or the President pro tem of the Senate, but usually it's actually the Senate parliamentarian who decides which committee the bill would go to in the Senate. Remember, a bill can start in either the Senate or the House unless it's a revenue bill. A revenue bill has to start with the House because revenue bills are supposed to be started in the House that's closer to the people, right? Because the House of Representatives is determined by population. It's supposed to be the people's house. Then it goes to the relevant committee, right? These are the standing committees. As remember, standing committees are the committees that are always existing. That's why they're called standing committees. When the bill goes to the standing committee, it gets kind of debated and talked about. Now, the committee membership is determined by the party leadership. So you want to suck up to your party leaders, right? The majority leader, the minority leader, the whip, right? So that you can get onto the committee that you think is going to best help either your own your political aspirations or best deliver for the district. So, for example, if you are an agricultural district, you want to be on the agricultural committee. If you have a, Cape Canaveral's in your district, you want to be on the science, space, and technology committee, right? Yeah.
Wait, is there a step between the idea for the bill and it going to the relevant committee?
It gets written, but and then submitted, and then the Speaker of the House or the Senate parliamentarian refers it to committee.
Shouldn't this step be before the Speaker refers it to that specific committee? Because they have to talk about it first and see.
No, it just gets submitted, and the Speaker refers it to the committee.
And then this is where
they talk about it, right?
Oh.
This is where they engage in markup, right? So they will mark up the bill. They will change the bill. They will come and have experts from the field testify. They will do research, right? They will have the government, the government Congressional Budget Office estimate how much it'll cost over 10 years, right? And then they will make amendments to the bill. Now, ultimately, you have to get this bill voted out of committee, but the committee chair is the ranking member from the majority party. So if it's a bill proposed by the minority party, unless it's a very popular bill, it probably dies in committee. Most bills die in committee, right? Most bills don't make it out of committee because bills get proposed every day, and most of them don't make it to the floor vote. Now, there is this thing called the discharge petition, in which if you get a majority of the House to vote, to sign it, basically, that it doesn't matter what the committee chair says, it goes to the House for a floor vote. But you have to have a majority of the House of Representatives sign the discharge petition, which is to say that it's to prevent the committee, a jerk committee chair from just holding up a bill. So once it comes out of committee, it goes to a floor vote. And here, the members of Congress are going to vote on the bill. Now they're going to be thinking in different ways. If they think like a delegate, they're thinking what do my constituents want? I'm going to consult public opinion polling in my district. I'm going to listen to my constituents' phone calls and emails and postcards, and basically do what does the majority of the people in my district or state want to do? The trustee model says actually I was chosen not just to be a mirror reflection of their interests, but because they chose me because they thought I have good judgment. So what do I think is best for my district? And that might be look, the people say they all voting against this, but it's in their long-term interest because over time it's actually going to bring more benefit, right? So this is the kind of saying look, the people sometimes make mistakes. I was chosen because I'm wise and qualified and I know what I'm doing, and I actually can do what's best in this kind of trustee model, right? So delegate is basically you are basically it doesn't matter who you are, you're just a reflection of public opinion of my district. If you're a trustee, you can remember it because I'm trusting you to make a good decision. Does that make sense? Danny, you had a question?
It's just the ones where they're thinking of the whole country, not just the district.
Yeah, I thought they do what
They
the
can-
constituents want while also taking into account.
Yeah, so they might also be thinking about the whole country as well. But the idea behind the trustee is it's I'm trusting you to make a good decision, right? There's also the Politico model in which remember, politicians are strategic thinkers. They want to get reelected. They might have you might be the member of the the member of the House of Representatives from California 42nd, but one day you want to run for senator or be governor of California. So you also are thinking about your own strategic ambitions. You're also thinking about all these other things. Because remember, politicians have multiple constituencies. They might be concerned citizens calling the phone and saying, "Hey, Representative Porter, I think you should vote against the bill." They also might be influenced by lobbyists. We'll talk about lobbying in Unit 2, but being hey, if you vote, what did I say? If you don't vote for the bill, I'll fund your opponent in the next campaign. They also have to listen to the party leaders. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries calls up Katie Porter and says, actually, the party needs you to vote for this bill. It doesn't actually matter what your constituents say, right? We need your vote to pass this bill, right? And so they are trying to balance all these competing considerations when they're deciding whether or not to vote, right? In addition to their own ideological proclivities and interests. Hooray! Our bill passed the House. Terrible news. The Senate Republicans use filibuster, and it's super effective, right? The filibuster is based on the Senate rules that allow for unlimited debate. This idea is that that unless you have a cloture vote of 60 senators voting for a cloture to close debate on the bill, it never advances to a vote. You basically can kill a bill by filibustering it, and one senator alone can kill the bill by saying that I'm going to by filibustering the bill. Now, originally this was a talking filibuster, and the original goal was to buy time to rally enough support to defeat the bill in a straight up or down vote. Now it's just basically said like any one it basically means that the Senate can't pass any laws unless you get 60 votes, because any one senator can just send an email to Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, and say, I'm filibustering this bill, and then it requires an extra vote called the cloture vote to get with a threshold of 60 votes. There are some ways you can go around the cloture. You can go around it using the reconciliation process. So if it is a budget or revenue bill, you can go through this process called reconciliation, which is not subject to the filibuster, because like the government needs to be able to raise and appropriate money. So a lot of times bills that have nothing to do with like budget get folded into a budget bill so they can go through reconciliation, right? Or you can bundle this bill into an omnibus spending bill. Like when the government is running out of money and we need to authorize government money, right? I need every one of you to vote for this so that we can keep the government, so we don't have a government shutdown, right? So that means that Violet gets to put her pet project in this bill. Danny gets to put her pet project in the bill. Shayna gets to put her pet project in the bill. And no one is going to vote against it because we need to keep the government running, right? So that's called an omnibus spending bill. That's another way you can kind of get around it, because like you're not going to filibuster that because you need to, keep the government open. So after all this, the bill finally goes to the president's desk, right? And the president is thinking, well, I could sign this into law or I could veto it. But if I veto it, if 2/3 of both houses vote to override it, I'll look weak, right? So the vetoes are actually kind of unlikely, right? Because like you only want to veto a bill if you know that they don't have the support to override the veto, because then you look politically weak. But so the president, when they veto a bill, they have to veto the entire bill. The Supreme Court said in Clinton versus New York that that the line item veto is unconstitutional. So you can't just be like, I'm going to strike out one provision, but keep the rest of the bill, right? So the president signs the bill into law, but that's not where the policymaking process ends.
Then he goes to the bureaucrat.
Yeah. Then President Biden goes to the EPA Administrator Michael Reagan and says, like, here's how you should interpret and implement the law that I just signed, right? Because Congress often writes laws relatively vague, right? Because they are not experts on every single policy area. And so they delegate some of that authority to the executive branch to like determine how exactly are we going to clean up the water? Like what exactly is the specific types of like fines and law and regulations and things like that. So Biden's EPA tells the EPA to enforce the law in such and such way. But however, it has to, any rules, this is called bureaucratic rulemaking, any regulatory rule that the EPA or the FCC or the IRS or the INS or any of these executive agencies proposes has to first go to a public comment period in which citizens can give a feedback, right? And we also have the problem of like iron triangles, right? Where the agency, the regulated industry, and the relevant congressional committee, right, are really in cozy relationships, right, where they're locked together in an iron triangle, right? So like, I don't want to regulate my fossil fuel buddies too hard, right, because they give a lot of money to my friends in Congress who write the laws that fund my agency, right? And so you get this kind of like circle of corruption, right, or iron triangle. Uh-oh. Texas thinks that the law is wrong. They object to the rule and think that the EPA is not following the law as written. So they sue the EPA in federal court. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, says, should we grant cert? He needs 4 votes to grant cert. 4 people say grant cert. And so we now have the Supreme Court will hear the case. So the Supreme Court, they hear briefs from the petitioner and the respondents. They hear oral arguments. They read the law and the Constitution. They consult relevant precedent. And also, people can submit briefs called amicus curiae briefs or friends of the court briefs. I think that's all of them. The court will then make a ruling. Weird. The 6 Republican appointees vote that the EPA broke the law. And then they give a 60-page explanation of the law using complicated legal jargon that no one really reads. Basically saying why they think the EPA broke the law. Then the 3 Democratic appointees say, we disagree, we dissent, and here's a bunch of complicated legal reasoning that says that the other team is wrong. John Roberts wonders if it's bad that the Supreme Court keeps making ideologically split and controversial decisions. Who could know? Okay. Any questions on that? I hope that you enjoyed my thought bubbles.
Someone actually be like analyzing the EPA, whatever.
Because that's always the one that always the example I use.
It was actually helpful to see like every single thing.
Yeah, that's why, because like we did like Congress, then we did like the executive branch, then we did the courts. It's like easier to kind of like see like from start to finish. And like we'll talk about this more when we talk about like political participation next unit. At every, you girls okay? Okay. At every stage in that process, right? Citizens, interest groups, social movements are trying to put pressure on the process, right? Like citizens are calling, they're protesting, they're writing letters. Interest group lobbyists are like promising money, right? People are making lawsuits, right? Like there's always potential for like people to try to influence the policymaking process. All right, last thing I want to look at is reviewing. Oh yeah, sorry, take it.
What was reconciliation?
Reconciliation is if the law is basically like a budgetary measure, like deals with the budget for the federal government, then it's not subject to a filibuster because like the government needs to be able to fund
And the
things.
filibuster is where the Senate can stop.
The filibuster, right, is where I say I'm filibustering the bill, and you need a 60-vote cloture vote
to override that.
The cloture vote technically stops debate on the bill, and then it goes to an up or down vote, right?
And what made up the Iron Triangle?
The what?
Iron Triangle?
It's the Iron Triangle is made up of the Congress or the relevant congressional committee, right? The industry in question, right? Like the fossil fuel industry, the like natural resources committee, and then like the EPA or the Department of Energy. And the idea is that like the regulated industry spends a bunch of money lobbying the agency and funding elections so that they can get laws written that help them. And that they try to buy off basically the agency. It's also called regulatory capture, which is the idea where like the agency being regulated, they put a bunch of money in to lobby the agency. They also will hire a bunch of former people who used to work for that agency to work on their staff to like figure out ways that they can kind of like either influence the regulation so they benefit them or like skirt the regulation so they don't have to pay fines and things like that. Okay. So I want to review the foundational documents in Supreme Court cases that you are accountable for, right? These could exist both in multiple choice questions. Like you could get a multiple choice question that's like, which of the following would the author of Brutus 1 most likely agree with? But you will also, on the FRQ 4, the argumentative essay, which you're just going to write the one paragraph for, you're not writing the full one, you are required to cite evidence from one of the listed documents. Now, that doesn't have to be a direct quote. It can just be like an idea or a general argument from that, but it should be an argument that's specific to like Brutus 1. So it shouldn't just be like, well, Brutus 1 disagreed with the Constitution. You should remember like that Brutus 1 makes a couple of arguments, and we're going to go through those now. And again, this is already on my TVT as a PDF, and I'm putting this recording on my TVT as well. So like you will have this to look at. Okay. The first foundational document we talked about was the Declaration of Independence. We didn't spend a lot of time on the Declaration of Independence because, like, we talked about it in APUSH. You've learned about it in 8th grade, right? But the key ideas here, right, is this idea of, like, the social contract, right? The social contract is the idea that the government's authority comes from the consent of the people governed by it, right? That power comes from the people, not from God, not from the king, right? The power flows up from the people. And that the government has to respect certain natural rights, right? That by virtue of being human, you have a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the goal of the government is to make it possible for you to enact those rights. It also separates the United States from Great Britain and makes the United States its own country. The Declaration of Independence is not law. It has no legal standing. It cannot be cited by the Supreme Court in terms of to determine like the constitutionality of something, right? The next is the Articles of Confederation. These formed the first form of government of the United States. This was based on the idea of like every state had equal representation. The central government was relatively weak, right? They couldn't raise an army. They couldn't collect taxes. There was no federal court system, no president. And to get any legislation passed, you had to have 9 of 13 states vote in favor of it. So the Articles of Confederation really left a lot of power to the state governments because it was conceived of not as a unified government, but as basically like a military and economic alliance between the states. It didn't work well because of things like Shays' Rebellion and massive amounts of debt that the federal government couldn't repay because it couldn't raise money.
Wait, was the Great Compromise because of the Articles?
The Great Compromise is when we get to writing the Constitution, right?
That was for Connecticut did that, right?
Yes.
'Cause they were like the middle state.
Right, because they meet in Philadelphia in 1787 to write a new constitution, and one of the things that they're debating over is like, should representation in the legislature be based on population, or should every state have equal representation? And the Connecticut Compromise is the House of Representatives will be determined by population as a bone to big states, and the Senate will be based on equal states, equal representation as a bone to small states, right? So the Constitution really. It's a product of compromise, right? Whether it's the Connecticut Compromise, the 3/5 Compromise, the compromise on the Electoral College can be seen as a compromise, right? The prohibition on outlawing the slave trade until 1808 is a compromise, right? But the key ideas under the Constitution, right? The idea of checks and balances, right? Each branch of government, this is Madison's argument in Federalist 51, that you are going to balance ambition against ambition. So like, the president can veto a law, Congress can override it. President gets to appoint agency heads, but they have to be approved by the Senate. The Congress can impeach the president, right? The Supreme Court can rule on executive actions, whether they are legal or whether a law passed by Congress is constitutional. The Congress can impeach a House of or as member of the Supreme Court, and the president gets to appoint members of the Supreme Court. So they're always kind of like interacting, right? The other key idea is like separation of powers. You cannot be both the president and a member of Congress, right? In the UK, the prime minister is the leader of the majority party in parliament, right? You are a member of parliament in the UK, right? So there is a unity. If like, there's no such thing as divided government in a parliamentary system, right? If you control the parliament, you also control the government. In the US, you could have one party win the Congress, which is like highly likely what will happen in this election, and another party win the presidency. So the government is staffed by one party, and the legislature is staffed by another party. And the idea of federalism, right? This idea that we're going to split power between the states and the federal government. The 10th Amendment is this idea of reserve powers, that any power not explicitly given to the Congress belongs to the states. Brutus thinks that this is bad. Brutus advances two arguments. The first is that the United States is too big to be a republic, that you cannot have democratic government in a country as big as the United States because the representatives are going to be too far from the people. There's too many different types of people, like different ethnic groups, different religions, different social groups, different economic bases, that you actually can't have representatives speak for the people in a large country. That every successful republic in history, he says, has been small. When Rome got too big, it turned into an empire, right? For direct democracy, yeah. Like, you couldn't have a direct democracy at the national level in the United States, where like every citizens are participating in, right? He also says that the federal government has too many powers. He points to the necessary and proper clause, the supremacy clause, the federal court system, all basically saying that this is going to quash the state governments, and that it's the state governments that are going to better uphold the rights of the people, and that it's going to destroy individual liberty.
Wait, so he wants the state to have more power?
Yeah, because he thinks that the states can both be more democratic and less likely to violate your liberties because they are more democratic, right? Madison disagrees. In Federalist 10, he argues that it's actually good to have a big country, because he says, look, in a democracy, in a republic, you're going to have factions. People are going to disagree about policy issues based on their economic or social or geographic interests, but that's you can't get rid of factions unless you basically like get rid of liberty, or you like mind control everyone to agree. That's not really possible or advisable. So instead, you have to try to mediate the negative impacts of factions. And he says that, look, in a large country, you're going to have so many different factions that they're all just going to balance each other out. He's kind of anticipating pluralist theories of democracy, that the different people are going to form different groups and balance each other out, and they're going to have to compromise to get things done. And he also says, look, in a big country, we're not going to have direct democracy. We're going to have a representative democracy, where the people choose representatives to make decisions, and that representation function is going to filter out the nut jobs, right? It's going to filter out extreme views and force compromise. Don't just point to your friends.
What?
So, like, factions are inevitable, but in a large representative republic, you can mediate the negative impacts of factions. Federalist 51 is the separate. Here's why the federal government actually isn't going to crush liberty. It's not going to crush liberty because we've built a system of checks and balances, right? He argues that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, right? Each branch of government has an incentive. He knows that they're going to try to expand their power and get more power. So rather than just so the way to do that is that you balance them against each other, so that as Congress tries to expand its power, it's going to butt up against the courts and the president, and they're going to fight back because they're also going to be expanding their power, right? So instead of doing a thing where, sorry to those of you watching at home because I'm going to draw arrows, right? So if you have Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president, right? As Congress is expanding, right, so is the Supreme Court and the president, right? So rather than trying to like set laws, right, like rather than trying to basically say like stay in your lane, the Constitution is designed to like have the natural ambitions of people balance each other out. Does that make sense? Okay. 2 more. Federalist 70. Oh yeah, sorry, David.
I don't think that's kind of about Federalist 10. It says representation of voters experience.
Because like it's not the people directly, right? When it's the people directly, you're more likely to be like swayed by extreme views because like you can get a few nut jobs to vote on something. But when you are choosing a representative for like several 10,000 people, right? You are more likely that representative, because they have to appeal to a wide constituency, is going to like end up like moderating those views. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay. Federalist 70 is like Hamilton's defense of the president. He says like, look, we need to have executive power vested in one person so they can for 2 reasons. First, it allows for better accountability, right? You know who did it. Right? The president did it. So you can impeach the president and hold them accountable. He also says that one person allows for an energetic executive. Now, he doesn't mean that the president should go to the gym every day. He means that like having a single person allows the president to act more quickly and get things done faster, especially in an emergency, right?
Wait, how would there be better accountability?
Because I know that you're the one who signed this executive order, where if it's like a council of 5 people, right, I don't know who is actually responsible for writing this executive order. Does that make sense? Federalist 78, Hamilton talks about the courts. He says that, look, the judicial branch is the weakest. It can't appropriate its own money. It can't enforce its own decisions. It doesn't have the military like the president does. But it is the guarantor of a free or limited constitution, because ultimately it's the courts that determine whether or not an executive action or an act of Congress has violated the law. Right? And this is an implied power of judicial review that is nowhere in the Constitution, but is implied in Federalist 78. Federalist 78 is one of the Federalist Papers that gets cited by the Supreme Court. Even though the Federalist Papers are not law, they are political propaganda. Because remember, the Federalist Papers were attempting to try to persuade delegates at the State of New York ratifying convention to vote for the Constitution. That's why Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote them. They are propaganda, they are not law. But they've become enshrined as our kind of dominant understanding of what the framers of the Constitution meant in each constitutional provision, because like Madison and Hamilton were there and they wrote a bunch of these provisions.
I'm so confused with Federalist 51. So what
Yeah.
exactly is like, invasion must be made to counteract invasion?
So rather than saying like we're only going to elect perfect people who aren't going to try to expand their power and abuse their power, we have to be realistic, right? Like I know that if you're president, you're going to try to abuse your power. So rather than like expecting, like saying shame on you, Gavin, for abusing your power, I'm also going to build a system where like Violet also wants to expand her power, and you're going to bump into each other by both trying to expand your power. Because by creating natural incentives, right? Like you want to expand executive power. She's going to check you by calling your agency head into a congressional testimony because she wants to expand Congress's power. Does that make sense that way? Okay. And there are 3 Supreme Court cases that you should be familiar with. I'm telling you literally everything you need to know. I'm not going to tell you the questions. Okay, the first one is Marbury versus Madison. Generally, for the required Supreme Court cases, you should know the background and the question, what constitutional principle or clause it involves, and what the holding and significance are. For Marbury versus Madison, you don't really need to know the details of a writ of mandamus. Like, don't get too caught up in that. The key idea is that Marbury versus Madison establishes the principle of judicial review. It says that the Supreme Court is allowed to nullify an act of the legislature or the executive branch that violates the Constitution, right? Nowhere in the Constitution is this language of judicial review explicit. Other countries' constitutions have an explicit constitutional court. The court was interpreting this as implied by the judicial power of Article 3, Section 1. So you should know, you really just need to know Marbury versus Madison judicial review. right? There's more complicated story about this and like what John Marshall was trying to do in balancing the political interests of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Because look, this was right after, and this is 1803, this is right after Thomas Jefferson wins the election in 1800, and we have the first time in the United States that we're transitioning from one political party in government to another political party in government, and he's trying to there's a more complicated historical story, but for our purposes, this establishes judicial review. Okay? The next important case is McCulloch versus Maryland. This is the question about the national bank, right? The two questions are, is the national bank constitutional? And can states tax branches of the national bank? The Supreme Court is ruling on the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause. It's basically saying that, look, the national bank is constitutional because of the necessary and proper clause. The Constitution says that Congress has the right to mint and coin money, therefore, and to collect taxes. Therefore, it makes sense that they have a bank where they can deposit the government's money, right? And Maryland can't tax the bank because that would give the state of Maryland more power than the federal government, violating the supremacy clause. So it affirms national supremacy over the states. The third case is United States versus Lopez. This is the Gun-Free School Zones Act. This one is only tricky because you see guns and you think it's about the Second Amendment, but it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. This is not a Second Amendment case. This case deals with whether or not this law, the Gun-Free School Zones Act, is within Congress's authority. Does Congress have the right to create gun-free school zones? The argument was whether or not this is a Commerce Clause violation. So the government argued that we have the right to do this because education is a Commerce Clause, because like if there's a shooting in California, it affects like school safety and school learning and students in Arizona, right? Because like you hear about a shooting in another state and you like get worried when you come to school, right? The Supreme Court rejected that argument and said that the Congress may not use the Commerce Clause to make possession of a gun in a school zone a federal crime. They did say that states can do this, right? Because states can pass gun-free school zones, right? But it cannot be a federal crime. This is a federalism case, right? This is taking power away from the federal government and giving it back to the states. It's not a Second Amendment case, right? This is like the only reason why this one is confusing, because you're like, Lopez, that's the gun one, Second Amendment. It's actually a Commerce Clause case. Okay, any questions about these Supreme Court cases?
Can you keep it up?
Yeah, I can keep it up for a minute. Eventually, you will write an FRQ where you are comparing a Supreme Court decision that they describe in the prompt to one of these 14 cases. It'll tell you which one to compare it to.
14.
We're going to have 14 by the end of the semester. Right. I will, before the end of the semester, I'm going to give you literally a sheet of paper with all the foundational documents, all the Supreme Court cases, this chart as a piece of paper for all 14 that you can just use to study. Why am I not giving it to you now?
My brain is literally about to explode with knowledge.
I am. I'm literally. I copied this chart from that piece of paper.
My brain's gonna explode from all how much stuff there is.
This is only like a third of the class.
That's crazy. I'm gonna buy 2 more notebooks.
I'm saying by the end of the semester.
I know, and then you'll just like memory hole it like spring semester and all fail the AP exam, because that's what always happens.
Are you doing like a review session?
I'll do review sessions in the spring before the AP exam.
A lot of this we're probably gonna, not a lot, but some we're gonna forget.
Yeah.
Oh, it's my class again.
Yeah.
It's
It's also.
It's a worse class.
No, but it's better because then you, after you take them, you have AP class, so it's like.
No, like actually, tell people that didn't take A push last year.
No,
Have fun.
it's not all the people who didn't take APE. It's a bunch. No, hang on. This is being recorded. I'm not talking.
What?
What happened? What were you gonna say? Pause it.
It's not a bunch of. It is people who took APUSH last year, and it's also a bunch of juniors who are taking econ this year
Juniors can take Gov.
because they needed another class to pair with econ. Because
Gov was a senior class.
it was supposed to be, but because of the way that we screwed up the scheduling, we,
every year.
So what are we gonna take next
yeah,
year?
I don't, probably nothing, like CompGov and Vietnam or something. But
They shouldn't be at all.
the problem is that they scheduled the timing wrong. They should have put macro in the spring and Vietnam in the fall, so they compare those. But yeah, like what
There's
you.
only one macro. Last year there were two.
Yeah, because like a bunch of you all took it, right? So there was less demand for it. Yeah.
There was so many
As it were.
errors this year. Everything.
Okay.
But it's getting worse.
Can I move on with my life?
Like no. Yeah,
Sure.
I guess.
All right. I want to just spend the last few minutes walking through an FRQ with you. I wanted to do this. What? No, the Facebook one that I just kind of like talk for 30 seconds about. I actually want to walk through it with y'all.
Are you sure you don't do the one that we're supposed to submit for credit?
No.
What is
Required foundational document.
So this is like how it's gonna be like.
This is what it will look like on the test, yeah, and on the AP exam.
You and Mr. Alberti really have to schedule your test for the same day.
Yeah, that was kind of a crazy.
I scheduled all of my tests before the school year started.
You know,
So-
you have to like.
And in class writing.
Okay, so.
I just don't know how to do it.
Alright, so you'll always get this FRQ style means you'll always get a scenario, right? The scenario will usually be like, it's like real scenario. Like it's something that actually happened in politics. It's like excerpts from a news article, right? It's not like a hypothetical like, President Birdie has recently nominated Danny Conrad to be in the Supreme Court, right? I know you wouldn't, but... All right, so in April of 2018, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of the social media company Facebook, was called to testify before the Senate Committee on Judiciary and the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation about, among other things, a data leak that led to 87 million users' private information being sold without their consent. Senators questioned Zuckerberg about whether Facebook could adequately regulate itself and protect personal information, or whether Congress should intervene. Zuckerberg defended the company, emphasizing its mission to better connect the world. In response, Zuckerberg stated, "My position is not that there should be no regulation. I think the real question is, as the internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what the right regulation, not whether there should be or not." Okay, so A, B, and C. A is always going to be a described, usually some like concept or constitutional provision that relates to this, right? So A is, referencing the scenario, describe the enumerated power in Article 1 of the Constitution that gives Congress the authority to regulate a business like the one above.
The Commerce Clause.
Why? Okay, so now you need to describe why. So the part 1 would say, like, the Commerce Clause gives Congress the authority to regulate Facebook because
I don't
Because it's stated in the Constitution.
Because it's interstate.
Yes, because like social media crosses state boundaries, right? It allows users to interact across state borders, buy and sell goods across state borders, right? Communicate across state borders. Facebook has employees in multiple states, right? They have probably data centers in multiple states, right? Because like a company as large as Facebook is going to be across multiple states. Does that make sense, right? So you need to explain how the specifics of the scenario relates to the constitutional provision or concept that's specified in A. Does that make sense what you're doing?
Yes.
Okay. B and C are always going to be more like explain and apply questions. So B in this case says, explain how the two-chamber structure of the legislature affects the ability of Congress to exercise the power described in Part A. So, how does a bicameral legislature affect the ability of Congress to exercise this power?
If Congress wants to pass a law regulating the use of commerce, then you should get this
In both houses.
And that would make it,
harder.
yeah, right? Because any law regulating Facebook would be required to pass both the House and the Senate. The two-chamber structure of Congress makes it much more difficult for Congress to pass legislation, especially when it's like controversial, right?
Wait, what laws can only be passed by one house?
None.
Okay.
Not laws. You can pass various resolutions, like if you want to censure a member of Congress for like saying that Jews have space lasers, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can do that without congressional. Doesn't have to pass the Senate, right?
Censure.
Wait, but
Like you did a bad thing and we're mad at you.
how does it being harder to pass the law relate to the Commerce Clause?
Because the Commerce Clause is a law, passing laws.
Wait, what?
The congressional power is passing laws under the Commerce Clause, and the two-stage structure makes it harder to do that,
Okay.
right? Because the law has to pass both houses, and then basically it creates extra hurdles. So you can say it makes it take.
So it makes it
that's
harder, like
Yeah.
the Commerce Clause.
It's not that the Commerce Clause makes it harder. It's
No, yeah.
It makes it
B
harder to
makes
use that power.
A harder.
right. Yeah, it's hard. Like Congress wants to pass a law regulating Facebook, basically like setting certain standards for data security, right? But that law, and they would say like, look, if it got challenged in the courts, they would say, look, it's constitutional because of the Commerce Clause.
Yeah, I understand.
But this is saying like to get that law passed, it would have to pass both houses, so it's going to take longer and be harder.
Wait, so how long should our responses be? Just like
I'd say like 2 to 3 sentences max.
Oh, so it's pretty short.
Yeah, these are
I thought
short.
I thought it had to be kind of like a paragraph. You
No. These are like 2 to 3 sentences.
Oh, so the detail, like the explicit detail is more for like when we're writing the
Yes.
actual like essay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Could we do one sentence if we say?
For A, you could do it in 1 sentence. For B, because you want to like say what like the two-chamber structure is and like how it affects legislation.
And it's always gonna be like that, like the two. I mean, isn't B just gonna be the same for basically every scenario?
No, because like if do you does anyone have a copy of the ones that I handed out last class? Right. Because like if you look at the example ones, right? B is like they're always gonna be. A is always like connect this scenario to either the constitutional clause or a course concept. B often has like things like so. This is one about the Patriot Act. A says describe the section of the Constitution that they would say is violated by the Patriot Act. B is explain how checks and balances could work to ensure that the section of the Constitution identified in Part A would be protected, right? So this is usually a describe, explain, and then C is usually an apply question. So C in this one, right? And this one is, if Congress decides to regulate how social media companies gather and use the data of their users, explain how these companies could use the political process to ensure that new regulation does not negatively affect them. This one, I wouldn't ask on the test because we actually haven't talked about interest groups yet. But lobbying, motivating voters to vote to like fund campaigns of people who sponsored the bill, appeal to voters to vote for new representatives, things like that.
And sorry, how many of these are we gonna have?
Just one.
Can they just one on the test?
Can they sue?
Oh yeah, you could sue in federal court.
And then it goes to the Supreme Court, right?
Eventually. There's only a few cases where a case goes directly to the Supreme Court if it involves like international law or if there's certain jurisdictional questions, right? Usually it starts in the district or the state courts. So like C would be lobbying. They could sue in the court system. They could try to get influence voters to like vote against people who propose the bill, things like that. Okay. Any questions on FRQ 1?
For C, since there's a bunch that you listed, could you just name like?
You could just name one, right?
So just say lobbying.
Yeah. You could say like, yeah, you would explain why. So you would say like Facebook could lobby members of Congress. This would involve like, donating money to congressional campaign committees or trying to persuade and influence Congress while they are writing the bill to ensure that the bill like does not negatively affect Facebook's business interests.
When you say Facebook sues.
You could say, yeah, Facebook could sue in federal court, arguing that the law passed by Congress it violates the Constitution. They could appeal this all the way up to the Supreme Court, who could declare it as unconstitutional.
So the test is like, what, like 20 MCQs?
20 MCQs.
One FRQ and
One of these,
And one of
and then a partial essay, right?
So how does this work?
So the essay, right, is that you're basically having to take a position, right? These are going to be more opinion-y, right? So like, for example, right, but like you're going to articulate a claim and a thesis. It's going to give you it's going to describe a kind of prompt. It's going to list 3 documents. You have to take a stand. You have to use evidence from one of those 3 documents. You have to use evidence from any other source. It could be another one of those 3 documents. It's nice and easy that way. It can be from your brain. It can be from one of the other documents not listed.
Oh, is this like the class or thing that we
Just basically
Yeah.
a DBQ kind of.
It's like a DDQ, but the documents aren't given to you.
But they are though, I thought.
They're not the text of them.
It's like an LQ, but the evidence is given to us.
It tells you Brutus 1. It doesn't give you the text of Brutus 1. So you have to
Oh.
remember what Brutus 1 says.
Oh, I see.
So that's why it's a little
It
tough.
gives you 3?
Yeah. I'm going to show you one
So if
example.
you don't remember one of them, can you
Like, well, all three are either for one side or the other?
Correct.
Okay.
And how long does it need to be?
Like one paragraph?
For the test, for the midterm, 1 paragraph is fine.
And for the exam?
For the exam, 2 to 3 paragraphs. So, environmental regulation is a complex policy area that involves both the states and the federal government. Develop an argument that takes a position on whether the federal government should primarily be responsible for managing environmental policy, or whether the state should be primarily responsible. Use at least one evidence from one of the following foundational documents. So it'll just tell you. So Brutus says states, Fed 10 says federal government, preamble of the Constitution says federal government. Look, you have paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, your counter argument.
But we only need one paragraph then.
This is for like the full essay, right? It's basically told you what to do, right? Like, don't overthink these. You don't need an introductory paragraph. You don't need to contextualize it. Literally, you can write thesis statement, paragraph 1. The Constitution was written to promote the general welfare of the United States, right? Environmental questions and pollution involve the entirety of the people, therefore they should be the provision of the United States federal government. Federal government also has more power and more resources to promote the general welfare. Additionally, in Federalist 10, Madison argues that a large representative republic is better able to mitigate the effect of factions, such as factions might represent either radical environmentalists or the oil lobby. And if we left this up to the states, they'd be more likely to be captured by a particular radical and factional interest, where if it's at the federal government, the nature of a representative system forces them to have to compromise between like the radical environmentalists that want to blow up pipelines and the oil lobby that doesn't care about the planet, forcing a more moderate and more equitable solution. However, a sympathizer of Brutus 1 would argue that state regulations are tyrannical, impose on the and negatively impact the authority of the states and to violate personal liberty. Brutus 1 would say that environmental policy should be left to the states because the states are going to be more responsive to the particular needs of the people, and different states might have different environmental needs. However, Brutus 1 is full of shit because of these reasons, right?
Wait, so we need 2 pieces of evidence in the first paragraph, but those 2 pieces can come from either one piece of, like one article,
Yes. For the full essay on the AP exam, you need 2 pieces of supporting evidence, right? Basically, when it says evidence, it means like, basically think of it as like 1 paragraph on one document, 1 paragraph on anything else, another supporting reason. It could be from another one of these documents. It could be like, you remember something that I've talked about like the waters of the United States or something. And then a counter argument, and usually you can use one of the documents as in your counter argument, right?
So for the midterm?
For the midterm, you're just writing the thesis and a paragraph. Think of it less as a specific evidence and a specific like reason based on one of those documents, right? So like if your thesis was like a while X claim because of it, Y, and Z, you're just doing the claim and Y, right?
Okay.
Is it always going to be the case where 2 of them are either going to be against or supporting, and the one that will be
It's not always
What?
the case that it's 2 versus 1, but there'll always be multiple sides.
But like, so there won't just be